If I had looked out the window just 30 seconds later, I would have missed the shovel. I would have missed the man, my neighbor of 11 years, kneeling in his backyard under the floodlight, digging like he had a demon chasing him from underground. I wouldn't have seen the way his hands trembled or how he kept glancing up at the surrounding houses as if he knew someone was watching. And maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't be haunted by the thought that a body had once been buried under the rose bushes. I live in Boulder, Colorado. Nice neighborhood, quiet street, the kind of place where people spend Saturday mornings washing their cars and waving to dog walkers. I moved in with my wife Tina over a decade ago. Next door lived Gregory and Helen Alston with their teenage son Liam. Good people, the kind you lend a ladder to or invite over for 4th of July burgers. Until 5 years ago, when Liam disappeared without a trace. He was 14, smart, funny, obsessed with his bike, and making YouTube videos about comic books. And then one day he just didn't come home. I remember Helen knocking on our door in a panic, Gregory pacing in their driveway, talking to police with wild eyes and shaking hands. There were flyers, search parties. A news crew parked out front for 2 days. I joined the volunteers, walking the woods behind the neighborhood, calling his name until our voices gave out. Nothing. No body, no backpack, no answers. The weeks dragged into months. The posters faded. And eventually, like most neighborhoods do after tragedy, we settled back into silence. But something in the Alstons had changed. Gregory stopped waving. Helen rarely came outside. The rose bushes she once trimmed every Sunday morning grew out of control. Liam's basketball hoop stayed up, but unused, the net shredded by wind and time. We never asked what the police had found. We never asked if they believed Liam had been taken or if they thought something worse. We just kept our distance, offering nods and quiet condolences when the opportunity felt right. Last week, that changed. It was Thursday, a sunny afternoon in early May. I was dragging the trash bin to the curb when Gregory approached me. He looked thinner, paler. He hadn't shaved in days, but he smiled faintly and asked if he could borrow a shovel. His was cracked, he said. Needed to do some backyard maintenance. Sure, I told him. Planting anything? Just digging something up, he replied. He laughed softly, like it was a joke, but his eyes didn't follow. I didn't think too hard about it then. I grabbed the good shovel from the garage and handed it over. He thanked me and walked off. It wasn't until that night, just after 10, that I looked out the upstairs window and saw him again. He was digging. Not a small hole, a trench. Wide, deep, methodical. He was sweating through his shirt, shoulders heaving, the floodlight casting sharp shadows across his yard. And it wasn't in some random corner of the property either. It was right under the roses. The same ones Helen used to dote on like children. The same patch of dirt she once said reminded her of her mother's garden in Spokane. It didn't sit right. Not the way he was doing it. Not the way he kept pausing to scan the surrounding windows. So I grabbed my spare shovel and headed over, telling myself I was just being neighborly. When I stepped into his yard and called his name, Gregory flinched hard, like I'd fired a gun. He dropped the shovel and rushed over, his hands shaking. No, Daniel, you shouldn't be here, he said. I frowned. You looked like you could use a hand. He didn't answer. He just stared at the shovel in my hand. Then, with a tone I'd never heard from him before, sharp, almost panicked, he said, I don't want that shovel in my backyard. Then he pointed at the gate, not rudely, just decisively, like I was a dog who'd wandered off leash. I left. No argument, but I didn't forget the fear in his voice. Back in my office, I turned off the lights and watched through the blinds. Gregory resumed digging for over an hour. Then he stopped, looked up at the houses again, including mine, and froze. He saw me. I stepped away from the window casually, heart racing. At 1:30 a.m., I heard the sound again, metal scraping earth. This time, I didn't watch from the window. I crept outside in the dark, barefoot on the cool grass, and peeked over the fence. He was still digging, slower now. weaker. He set the shovel down and disappeared inside. I took my chance. I slipped into his yard, heart pounding so loud I was sure it would wake the neighborhood. I stood over the hole. The roses were gone, torn out and discarded. The soil was dark, damp, freshly broken, and then I saw it, a torn edge of black plastic, peeking from the earth like a buried secret. A garbage bag. I didn't dig. I didn't touch it. I just stared. I looked at his back door, then back at the bag, then back at the door. Then I ran. Seconds later, Gregory stepped back outside. He didn't return to the hole. He walked slowly around the side of the house and vanished. I crawled back through my yard, through the mud, and into bed beside Tina without a word. The next morning, I looked out the window. The hole was gone, leveled, flattened, like nothing had ever happened. No roses, no tools, just fresh dirt and a newly installed solar light stuck in the ground like a grave marker. My shovel wasn't returned. Gregory's SUV was no longer in the driveway. It was on the street, trunk facing out. He didn't wave when I saw him that afternoon. He didn't even glance in my direction. That evening, I pulled my blinds and saw him at his window, watching me. He didn't blink. He didn't move. He just stared. I haven't told anyone. Not Tina. Not the police. Not a soul. Because what do you say? I think my neighbor unearthed the body of his missing son last night and possibly moved it somewhere else. And oh, by the way, I lent him the shovel? It sounds crazy, but every time I walk by that side of his yard, I feel it. That chill, that silence, that knowledge that something once lived there, something that doesn't anymore. And I'm the only one who knows. Or worse, I'm not. If you'd asked me back then, I would have said I was the mature one. I was 15, proud of the way I looked after my 10-year-old brother Ben, proud of how I didn't get caught up in the dumb drama that filled high school hallways. I liked nature, photography, quiet afternoons by the river. I didn't get into fights, and I didn't go looking for trouble. But I've since learned that sometimes trouble doesn't wait for you to find it. Sometimes it walks up to you with a half smile and invites you on an innocent little trip through the woods. We had moved to Savannah, Georgia just a few months earlier. The house was older but cozy, tucked into a pine-lined street with cracked sidewalks and the occasional swing hanging from a front yard tree. It felt like the kind of place where kids grew up safe, where nothing too bad ever really happened. That's probably why my parents didn't think twice when two boys from down the road, Tyler and Zach Mason, started showing up around our driveway. They were brothers, Tyler around my age, Zach a little younger. We didn't go to the same school. They were homeschooled, apparently. Their dad was a long-haul trucker, gone most weeks. Their house always looked half abandoned. Uncut grass, busted shutters, porch lights that flickered but never got fixed. They were odd, sure. Quiet in that way that makes you wonder what they're thinking. But they weren't outwardly dangerous. Not then. I was shooting hoops with Ben one Saturday when Tyler approached us. He didn't say much, just stood there watching for a bit before asking, "You ever shoot BB guns?" I said I had, once or twice. He nodded toward Zach, who stood at the end of our driveway with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "We're going out tomorrow. By the river. Woods go on for miles out there. Bring your brother if he wants." I should have asked more questions. I should have listened to that strange pause in his voice. But I didn't. I was 15, bored, and honestly, I was flattered they'd invited me. Maybe it was stupid, but I thought, maybe they're not so bad. Maybe they're just lonely. Ben was excited. I gave him a firm, "only if you listen to me the whole time" warning, and he nodded like I was his personal hero. Sunday came, and the Mason brothers arrived just before dusk. They were wearing camo gear, long sleeves despite the heat. The duffel bag between them looked heavy, too heavy for a few plastic air rifles. They barely said a word on the way to the woods. Ben and I shared glances, a mix of confusion and amusement. The silence wasn't just awkward. It was loaded. We followed them down a dirt trail through the trees, past rusted fences and old beer cans, toward a part of the river I hadn't explored before. It was quiet there. Still. You could almost forget the rest of the world existed. Zach dropped the duffel bag with a thud that startled the birds. Tyler crouched and unzipped it. I expected BB guns. What came out were real rifles, not cheap lookalikes, not props. Actual, full-length steel and wood hunting rifles, wrapped in old towels and smelling faintly of oil and smoke. I didn't say anything at first. I couldn't. My brain needed a second to catch up. Then Zach, without a word, loaded a round into one of the rifles and fired it across the riverbank. The sound tore through the trees like a thunderclap. Ben flinched behind me, his hand grabbing mine on instinct. "What the hell?" I muttered. Tyler looked at me, calm as ever. "Dad's. He don't use them much. You said BB guns?" He shrugged. "These are better." Ben tugged on my shirt. "Michael, I want to go home." Tyler grinned and reached into the bag, pulling out a third rifle. "You can shoot if you want. We won't tell." "No," I said immediately. I turned to Ben and took the gun that had somehow made it into his hands when I wasn't looking. My heart was pounding. "We're done. Come on." Zach fired again, laughing as a branch cracked and fell from a tree. We turned to leave. Behind us, I heard a voice. Low, muttered, maybe Tyler's. "Little bitches." I didn't look back. Ben and I didn't speak the whole way home. Not a word. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made my chest tighten. I kept thinking about those guns, about the ease with which they handled them, about the way they looked at us, not as friends, not even as people, but like toys they hadn't finished playing with. At 2:17 a.m., I woke up to a draft. My bedroom window was open. I sat up slowly. There was a shape standing beside my bed, Tyler. I saw the glint of metal before I felt it, the barrel of the rifle pressing gently, intimately against the back of my head. "Shh," he whispered. I didn't move. "You talk to anyone," he said, his voice so close it made my skin crawl, "especially your parents, and I'll shoot you. Then I'll shoot your little brother." I swallowed hard. "Okay," I whispered. He pulled the barrel back, gave me a soft tap on the back of the skull, like I was a dog he was finished scolding. Then he climbed back out the window. I locked it behind him with shaking fingers. Ben didn't know. I didn't tell him. But over the next week, he started sleeping with the hallway light on. He stopped playing outside. He wouldn't even walk past the Mason house on our way to school. Sometimes, late at night, I'd see movement in their window. A face, watching. 3 days before we moved, I heard something hit the window. A rock, maybe? I looked out and saw Tyler standing in the yard across the street. He lifted something, a flashlight in one hand, the rifle in the other. He lit up his own face, smiled, and mouthed the word, "Bang!" I dropped to the floor. We moved to Warner Robins the following week. My parents thought it was a new job opportunity. We never told them otherwise. Years later, I still remember every detail. The river, the rifles, the way Tyler smelled faintly of gasoline and something sour. The moment when I realized that kindness, my tendency to give people the benefit of the doubt, could have gotten my brother killed. Ben's married now, has a kid on the way. He barely remembers that summer. I remember everything. There's a scar on my wrist from a branch I tripped over when we ran out of those woods. It's faint now, easy to miss, but I still trace it sometimes when I can't sleep. We always think monsters look like something else, masks, claws, fangs. But sometimes they look like your neighbor, like a kid in camo, like someone who smiles too easily when they put a gun in your hand. I never saw the Mason brothers again, but I still have dreams where I wake up to find the window open, the gun pressed to my head, and the voice whispering, "Shh." The first time I saw her, she was sitting perfectly still on the front porch, rocking slightly. Arms locked around her knees, eyes fixed on nothing. Her mouth moved, but no words came out. I wasn't sure if she was humming or just trying to breathe through whatever storm was in her head. That was the moment I knew I hadn't moved into a quiet neighborhood. My name is Alyssa. I'm a therapist. I've spent the last 7 years helping people confront their trauma and peel back layers of fear and walk towards some version of healing. I've worked with children, veterans, abuse survivors. I've seen psychosis and darkness, and I still believe people are capable of change. But what happened on that street in Portland, Oregon, made me realize something else. Belief isn't always enough. I moved into that rental home during a chaotic point in my life. I'd just ended a long-term relationship. I was emotionally fried and financially stretched. The place wasn't much, peeling paint, weird plumbing, creaky floors, but it had charm and, more importantly, privacy. The backyard faced a patch of overgrown woods, and the air smelled like wet pine and fresh starts. The house next door was worn, its curtains always drawn. I'd been told an older woman named Joanne lived there with her adult daughter, Rachel. That was all anyone seemed to know. At first, I kept my distance. I nodded when we crossed paths, but didn't try to force neighborly chit-chat. Rachel never made eye contact. Joanne barely acknowledged me. And then, one night around 11 p.m., I heard the screaming. It was violent, guttural. A shriek that pierced straight through drywall and into bone. Furniture scraped against floors. Glass shattered. Then silence. Then more screaming. I stood in my kitchen, frozen. I didn't know whether to call the police, knock on their door, or just pretend I hadn't heard anything. Eventually, I did what most people do when they're unsure. I did nothing. I went to bed and told myself they had it under control. But it wasn't a one-time thing. The next night, it happened again, and the next. Not always at the same time, but always the same pattern. Rachel would scream, sometimes words, sometimes just sounds, and Joanne would try to calm her in a tired, robotic voice. I could hear her say things like, "Not now, sweetheart," and "It's not real," like she was coaching a child through a nightmare. And I tried, truly tried, to be understanding. This is what I had trained for. This was what I believed in. But over time, that empathy began to warp into something else. Because it wasn't just the screaming. Sometimes, in the early hours of the morning, I'd find Rachel standing in their yard, just standing, facing my house, or pacing back and forth in jerky, stuttering steps, muttering. Once she pointed directly at my window and started laughing. Not a full laugh, just this dry, broken sound that made the hairs on my neck rise. One day, I came home to find muddy handprints on the side of my porch railing. Another time, I opened my front door and saw a crumpled drawing on my mat. A child's sketch. Stick figures. One of them had red marker scribbled across the face. The others were crossed out. I didn't know what to do. I documented everything. I called the landlord, who muttered something about the situation being delicate. I considered calling Adult Protective Services. But every time I built up the nerve, Rachel would vanish again behind the curtains, and I'd feel like I was overreacting. Then came the night everything changed. It was a Thursday, just before midnight. The screaming was worse than usual. Furniture thudded against the walls. I heard Joanne shouting, "Let go! Rachel, let go!" Then a crash so loud I thought their living room had collapsed. I couldn't take it anymore. I walked next door and banged on the door with more anger than I meant to. Joanne opened it halfway, scowling. "What do you want?" I tried to steady my voice. "I'm sorry, but the noise, it's constant. I need to sleep. I have clients early tomorrow." She rolled her eyes. "She has episodes." "I understand that, but this is every night. Can't she get help?" That's when Rachel appeared in the hallway, barefooted, eyes wild, hair like a halo of chaos around her head. "How dare you?" she screamed. And before Joanne could stop her, she lunged toward the door. Joanne slammed it shut just in time. The lock clicked. I stood there, breathing hard, fists still raised. I didn't sleep well that night. I remember waking up in the dark, the kind of waking that doesn't come from sound or light, but from instinct. My body knew something was wrong before my mind caught up. The room was quiet, still. Then I heard a sound. Breathing. Not my own. I reached for my phone, turned on the flashlight, and swept it slowly across the room. There, crouched by the side of the bed, inches from my pillow, was Rachel. Her face illuminated in the beam, twisted into something between a smile and a snarl. Her fingers twitched. She screamed. I screamed back. I scrambled out of bed, knocking over a lamp. She lunged. I pushed past her, bolted out the door, and slammed it behind me. She banged against it with her fists, screeching. I ran downstairs, locked the door that separated the floors, and called the police. When they arrived, Rachel was still upstairs, still screaming, still pounding. Joanne stood on the front lawn in a bathrobe, arms crossed, eyes burning holes into mine. She didn't mean to hurt her, she said. She just gets confused. The officers took Rachel into temporary custody. One of them asked if I wanted to press charges. I looked at Joanne, standing there like a statue, and I remembered the sound of her daughter's breathing in my room. I said no. Rachel was gone for the rest of the night, but she came back the next evening. No apology, no explanation. Just Joanne sitting on the porch again, arms crossed, staring at my door. I didn't sleep for days. Eventually, I broke my lease. I packed quickly and moved out. My landlord didn't argue. I think he'd known, on some level, that this was inevitable. And here's the part I still wrestle with. I still believe in compassion. I still believe in second chances and mental health support and the capacity for healing. But I also believe in boundaries, in fear, in the right to feel safe in your own home. Because it's one thing to hear a scream through the wall. It's another thing entirely when that scream is coming from the floor beside your bed. And sometimes, when the screaming finally stops, the silence is worse. After everything I've been through, the missing boy buried in silence, the neighbors with guns and no conscience, the woman who crept into my bedroom in the middle of the night, there's one thing I've learned. You never really know who lives next door. These weren't monsters from horror movies. These were real people, ordinary, familiar, and that's what makes it so terrifying. Gregory was a grieving father. Tyler and Zach were just kids. Rachel was someone's daughter. But behind those walls, something was broken, something dangerous. I tried to understand, to offer help, to be the good neighbor. But sometimes that's not enough. Each story left a scar. Not always visible, but lasting. They taught me to trust my instincts, to listen when the air changes, to act when silence feels too loud. And maybe that's the lesson here. Be kind, but be cautious. Be human, but be alert. You don't need to fear everyone, but you should never ignore your gut. In a world that values politeness over protection, don't apologize for choosing safety. Whether it's calling for help, setting boundaries, or walking away, your safety matters more than someone else's comfort. If these stories resonated with you, unsettled you, or made you think twice about the world just beyond your front yard, consider subscribing to this channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep bringing true stories that reveal the darkness hiding in plain sight. Because sometimes, the scariest stories are the ones that could happen to you. Subscribe and stay safe, always.